The road stretched long and narrow ahead, bordered by tall pines and whispering fields. Jack Hunter adjusted his grip on the wheel of his aging Ford truck, his knuckles pale as they clutched the leather-worn steering wheel. In the passenger seat, his 13-year-old daughter Ella sat quietly, her headphones in, staring out at the endless expanse of green. The silence between them was both familiar and heavy, like a suitcase packed too full but never opened. "Almost there," Jack said, breaking the silence. Ella nodded but didn't look at him. Her dark brown eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her hoodie. Ridgepoint, population barely 2,000, was the kind of town most people drove through without stopping. But for Jack, it was a deliberate choice, a place to start over. After years of military service and the recent loss of his wife, he wanted peace, and Ridgepoint seemed as close to peace as one could find. Their new home came into view, a modest two-story farmhouse with chipped paint and a sagging porch. Jack had found it online, listed as a fixer-upper with potential. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Jack parked the truck and stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. He glanced up at the house, taking in the overgrown yard and leaning mailbox, then back at Ella, who had yet to move from her seat. "You coming?" She shrugged and slid out of the truck, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She didn't say a word as she trudged up the porch steps, the wood creaking under her slight frame. Jack sighed. This wasn't going to be easy. Inside, the house smelled of dust and old wood. Sunlight streamed through cracked blinds, casting long shadows across the bare floors. Ella dropped her bag in the living room and disappeared upstairs without a word. Jack stood alone in the empty space, listening to her footsteps fade. He set to work unpacking the essentials, a few boxes of clothes, kitchenware, and family photographs. One photo stopped him. It was of his wife, Sarah, smiling beside him on a beach, Ella sandwiched between them, her face sticky with melted ice cream. Jack's throat tightened as he placed the photo on the mantel. He glanced at the stairs. Ella hadn't smiled like that in a long time. The next morning, Jack drove Ella to school. Ridgepoint Middle was a low, squat building with peeling paint and a flagpole that leaned slightly to the left. Kids clustered in groups outside, their laughter sharp and unfamiliar. "You'll be fine," Jack said as Ella stared at the building. She didn't answer, just pulled her backpack tighter and stepped out of the truck. Jack watched her walk inside, her shoulders hunched like she was bracing for a storm. Jack spent the day exploring Ridgepoint. He stopped by the local diner for coffee, where the waitress, a chatty woman named Linda, welcomed him with a smile. "New in town?" she asked, pouring his coffee. "Yeah, moved in yesterday," Jack replied. Linda leaned against the counter. "Well, welcome to Ridgepoint. Quiet place for the most part." Jack nodded. "That's what I'm hoping for." As he sipped his coffee, he noticed a group of men at a corner booth, their leather jackets emblazoned with a red vulture emblem. Their voices were low, but their presence dominated the room. "Who are they?" Jack asked Linda. Her smile faded. "That's the Red Vultures. Local troublemakers. Best to steer clear." Jack watched as one of the men glanced his way, a smirk tugging at his lips. Jack didn't flinch, meeting his gaze with the calm steadiness of someone who had seen far worse. That afternoon, Ella came home with a tear in her jacket and a scraped knee. Jack frowned as he helped her clean the wound. "What happened?" he asked. "Nothing," she muttered, avoiding his eyes. Jack didn't press, but his gut told him there was more to the story. Later that evening, Jack stood on the porch, looking out at the darkening sky. The chirping of crickets was broken by the distant roar of motorcycles. He tensed, his military instincts flaring. As the sound grew louder, a group of bikers sped past the house, their engines growling like predators. Jack's eyes narrowed as he watched them disappear down the road. Inside, Ella peered out the window. "Who are they?" "Trouble," Jack said quietly. The days passed, but the unease lingered. Jack noticed the way neighbors avoided eye contact, the way Ella hesitated before leaving for school. One afternoon, he found her sketching in her notebook. Her drawings were dark, scenes of wolves circling a lone figure in the woods. "They bothering you?" Jack asked, gesturing to the sketches. Ella hesitated, then nodded. "A boy at school. He's one of them. The gang. Jack's jaw tightened. He knelt beside her, his voice steady. Listen to me. No matter what they say or do, you stay strong. You don't let them see fear. Understand? Ella nodded, her eyes wide. That night, Jack sat at the kitchen table, cleaning an old handgun he hadn't touched in years. As he reassembled the weapon, his mind raced. Ridgepoint wasn't the sanctuary he had hoped for, but he wasn't going to let anyone threaten his daughter. The house was silent, but Jack's senses were sharp. Outside, a shadow moved across the porch. He stood, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun. When he opened the door, there was nothing but the cool night air. Yet the unease remained, a silent promise that peace was not yet theirs. This chapter sets the stage for Jack and Ella's journey, establishing their emotional struggles, the danger posed by the red vultures, and Jack's resolve to protect his family. The tension steadily builds, hinting at the challenges to come. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of the farmhouse, casting golden streaks across the kitchen table. Jack sat nursing a cup of coffee, his gaze distant. Ella was upstairs, likely still in bed, but Jack's thoughts were on the gang he'd seen at the diner. The memory of the red vultures lingered like a storm cloud, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Ridgepoint was far from the peaceful town it pretended to be. Jack stepped out onto the porch to find a small, grim token waiting for him. A dead bird, its feathers ruffled and its neck twisted, lay on the wooden steps. The sight sent a chill up his spine. He crouched down, examining the bird, and his eyes caught something written on the underside of the step in red spray paint. Leave while you can. Jack's jaw tightened as he straightened. His military instincts kicked in, and he scanned the street. Everything seemed normal, but the message was clear. This wasn't a warning. It was a declaration. Ella appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "What's that?" she asked, noticing the bird. "Nothing you need to worry about," Jack said, quickly scooping up the bird and tossing it into the trash. She frowned, sensing something was off, but didn't press. Jack glanced back at the spray paint and made a mental note to cover it up later. After dropping Ella off at school, Jack stopped by the town's auto shop, where his truck was due for some maintenance. The shop owner, Tom Harris, was an older man with grease-streaked hands and a knowing look in his eye. "Morning, Tom," Jack said as he walked in. Tom wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. "Morning. What can I do for you?" Jack hesitated before speaking. "I ran into some trouble the other day. The red vultures." Tom's expression darkened. "They bother you?" "Not yet," Jack replied, "but they left me a message. Something about leaving town." Tom sighed, leaning against the counter. "They've been running things around here for years. Drugs, extortion, intimidation, you name it. Most folks just keep their heads down and hope they don't get noticed." Jack frowned. "And the sheriff?" "Sheriff Mason's a good man," Tom said, "but he doesn't have the resources or the manpower to take them on. It's just him and a couple of deputies." Jack's thoughts churned as Tom handed him the truck's keys. He was starting to understand why Ridgepoint felt so tense. At school, Ella sat alone at lunch, sketching in her notebook. A shadow fell over her table, and she looked up to see Zane, a lanky boy with a leather jacket bearing the red vulture's emblem. "Nice drawing," Zane sneered, grabbing her notebook. "Give it back," Ella said, her voice steady but her hands trembling. Zane flipped through the pages, smirking at the dark, brooding sketches. "You think you're special or something?" Ella stood, reaching for the notebook, but Zane pulled it away. "I said give it back." A teacher's voice cut through the tension. "Zane, enough?" The boy reluctantly handed the notebook back and sauntered off, but not before muttering, "Watch your back." Ella sat down, clutching the notebook to her chest. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Stay strong. Don't let them see fear." That evening, Jack painted over the graffiti on the porch while Ella did her homework at the kitchen table. He watched her out of the corner of his eye, noting the way her shoulders were hunched, the way she tapped her pencil nervously. "Something happened today?" Jack asked. Ella hesitated, then nodded. "There's a boy at school. Zane. He's with the gang." Jack set the paintbrush down and sat across from her. "What did he do?" "He took my notebook," Ella said, her voice barely above a whisper. Said something about watching my back. Jack's expression hardened. You tell a teacher? She nodded. They told him to stop, but it doesn't matter. He's not scared of them. Jack reached across the table, resting a hand on hers. Then he's not as tough as he thinks. You keep standing up for yourself, Ella. And if he does anything else, you let me know. Ella nodded, a flicker of resolve in her eyes. Later that night, Jack stood in the living room, staring out the window. The farmhouse was dark and quiet, but his mind raced. He thought about the red vultures, about their influence over the town, and about Zane's threat to Ella. He retrieved an old lockbox from the closet and opened it to reveal a pistol, ammunition, and a combat knife. He hadn't touched these tools since leaving the Marines, but now he felt their weight like an old scar reopening. Jack disassembled and cleaned the gun with methodical precision, the ritual calming his nerves. He didn't want trouble, but if trouble came, he would be ready. The next morning, Jack walked Ella to the truck for school. As they reached the driveway, he noticed fresh tire marks in the gravel. Stay here, Jack said, his voice low. He crouched, examining the tracks. They were fresh, too fresh. His eyes scanned the horizon, but there was no sign of anyone. When he dropped Ella off at school, he parked for a moment and watched the entrance. He saw Zane loitering near the steps, his eyes briefly meeting Jack's before the boy turned away. That afternoon, Jack returned to Tom's auto shop. Tom, I need some advice, Jack said. Tom raised an eyebrow. About what? The vultures. How do they operate? Tom scratched his chin. They move like a pack. Vince Cole's the leader. Mean, violent, and smart. But it's not just him. He's got connections, people outside Ridgepoint who keep him supplied and protected. Jack nodded, filing the information away. Thanks. Tom hesitated. You planning something? Not yet, Jack said, but I want to be ready if they push too far. That evening, as the sun set over Ridgepoint, Jack and Ella sat on the porch. The air was still, but Jack couldn't shake the sense of something lurking just beyond the horizon. Do you think we'll ever be safe here? Ella asked, her voice quiet. Jack put an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. We will, he said, his voice steady. But sometimes, safety isn't something you find. It's something you make. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, Jack knew he would do whatever it took to make Ridgepoint safe, for Ella, and for everyone else too afraid to fight back. This chapter deepens the tension and stakes, showing Jack's growing awareness of the threat and his resolve to confront it. Ella's challenges at school parallel Jack's struggles, emphasizing the theme of resilience. The Red Vulture's presence looms larger, setting the stage for more significant confrontations. The day started like any other. The sky over Ridgepoint was a calm, pale blue, and the streets were quiet. Jack dropped Ella off at school, watching her disappear into the building before heading to the hardware store to pick up supplies for the house. Despite the growing tension in the town, Jack clung to the hope that things could stay normal, at least for a little while longer. But the Red Vultures had other plans. Ella's day began uneventfully. She sat through math and English, exchanging notes with Mia during breaks. Mia, one of the few people she trusted at school, leaned over during lunch and whispered, Zane's been talking about you. Ella froze mid-bite. What did he say? Mia hesitated. Just to stay away from him. He's been bragging to his friends, saying he's got something planned. Ella brushed it off with a nervous laugh, but the knot in her stomach tightened. By the time school let out, Ella's unease had grown. She decided to take a different route home, avoiding the usual streets where Zane and his friends often lingered. The shortcut led her through a quiet stretch of woods near the outskirts of town. Halfway through the trail, she heard the growl of an engine. Ella froze. The sound grew louder, and before she could react, a black van pulled up beside her. The door slid open, and Zane grinned at her from inside. Hey, Ella, need a ride? She turned to run, but rough hands grabbed her from behind, yanking her into the van. The door slammed shut, and the vehicle sped off, leaving only the faint sound of Ella's muffled cries behind. Jack came home in the early afternoon, expecting to find Ella waiting on the porch. Instead, he found her backpack lying in the dirt by the road. The sight stopped him cold. He knelt, picking it up and brushing off the dirt. His eyes scanned the area, noting tire tracks leading away from the house. "Ella," he called, his voice echoing in the stillness. No response. Jack's grip on the backpack tightened as his mind raced. He knew something was wrong, terribly wrong. Inside the house, Jack grabbed his phone and dialed Ella's number. It rang several times before going to voicemail. He tried again, with the same result. He paced the living room, his heart pounding, until he noticed the message light flashing on the landline. Jack played the message, and a distorted voice filled the room. "You didn't listen, Hunter. Now you'll learn. If you want the girl back, stay out of our business." Jack's blood ran cold. He slammed the phone down and grabbed his keys, his mind already calculating his next move. Jack's first stop was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Mason looked up from his desk as Jack stormed in, the backpack clutched in his hand. "They've got Ella," Jack said, his voice low and urgent. Mason stood, his face grim. "Who?" "The Red Vultures," Jack replied. "They left this by the road and called my house. They're sending a message." Mason cursed under his breath. "We'll put out an alert and start looking, but these guys don't play fair. They know how to stay hidden." Jack leaned in, his voice deadly calm. "Then I'll find her myself." Mason hesitated. "Hunter, I can't have you going vigilante on me." "I'm not asking for permission," Jack said. "I'm asking for information. Where would they take her?" Mason sighed and pulled out a map of Ridgepoint. "There's an old sawmill on the outskirts of town. They've used it before. It's isolated, easy to defend." Jack studied the map, committing it to memory. "Thanks." "Jack," Mason called as he reached the door. "Be careful. These guys are dangerous." Jack didn't respond. Ella sat in the back of the van, her wrists bound with zip ties. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Stay strong. Don't let them see fear." Zane leaned back from the front seat, grinning. "Your dad thinks he's some kind of hero. Let's see how he likes being helpless for once." Ella glared at him but stayed silent. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. The sawmill loomed ahead, its crumbling walls covered in graffiti. Inside, Vince Cole waited, his broad frame casting a shadow under the dim light of a single bulb. He smirked as the van pulled up. Zane dragged Ella out and shoved her forward. "Here she is." Vince studied her, his grin widening. "She looks like him. Same fire in the eyes." Ella's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent. "Let's see if that fire burns out," Vince said, nodding toward a dark corner where chains hung from the wall. Jack parked his truck a mile from the mill, stepping out with nothing but a flashlight and his sidearm. His military training took over as he moved silently through the woods, following the faint sound of laughter and the glow of light spilling from the mill's broken windows. He crouched near the building, scanning the perimeter. 2 guards stood by the entrance, smoking and chatting casually. Jack moved swiftly, taking them down one by one without a sound. Inside, he crept through the shadows, his heart pounding as he searched for Ella. Ella sat on the floor, her back against the wall, as Vince paced in front of her. "Your dad thinks he's untouchable," Vince sneered. "But everyone has a weakness. And you're his." Ella stared at him, her voice steady. "You're wrong." Vince laughed. "We'll see." The lights suddenly went out, plunging the room into darkness. "What the?" Vince growled, reaching for his flashlight. Glass shattered somewhere in the mill, followed by a muffled thud. Vince's men scrambled, shouting orders, but their voices were cut short one by one. "Find him!" Vince roared. Jack moved like a shadow, taking out the gang members with precision. He finally reached the main room and spotted Ella, her eyes wide with relief as their gazes met. "Dad!" Jack stepped into the light, his gun trained on Vince. "Let her go." Vince smirked. "You're brave, I'll give you that. But you're outnumbered." Jack's gaze didn't waver. Not for long. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Vince's smirk faltered as he realized what was happening. "You called the cops?" "I told you," Jack said coldly. "You don't mess with my family." As the sheriff's cars pulled up, Vince and his remaining men tried to flee, but Jack wasn't done. He tackled Vince, pinning him to the ground until Mason arrived to cuff him. Ella ran to Jack, tears streaming down her face. He pulled her into a tight embrace, whispering, "I've got you. You're safe now." But as they walked out of the mill, Jack's jaw tightened. He knew this wasn't over. Vince might be behind bars, but the Red Vultures were far from finished. This chapter amps up the stakes with Ella's kidnapping, Jack's tactical rescue, and the first significant confrontation with the gang. It sets the stage for the ongoing battle between Jack and the Red Vultures while highlighting the bond between father and daughter. The mill was quiet now, its darkened halls cleared of the Red Vultures. Vince Cole sat in the back of a sheriff's car, his face bruised but still twisted in a defiant smirk as the deputies hauled him away. Jack watched from a distance, his arm around Ella's shoulders, her tear-streaked face buried in his chest. Relief coursed through him, but his mind was already racing ahead. Vince might be in custody, but the fight was far from over. That night, the farmhouse felt different, less like a home and more like a fortress under siege. Jack double-checked every lock, installed a wooden bar over the front door, and placed a chair under the knob of the back one. Ella sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa. She hadn't said much since they returned home. "You okay?" Jack asked, pulling up a chair across from her. She nodded but didn't meet his eyes. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you didn't find me." Jack reached across the table, resting a hand on hers. "But I did, and I always will." Ella's lips trembled. "They're not done, are they?" Jack hesitated before answering. "No. Men like Vince don't give up that easily." "Then what do we do?" Jack's jaw tightened. "We get ready." The next morning, Sheriff Mason arrived at the farmhouse, his face a mix of concern and frustration. "Vince isn't talking," Mason said as Jack poured him a cup of coffee. "He knows how to play the game. Lawyered up the second we brought him in." Jack leaned against the counter. "What about his men?" "Couple of them gave us some scraps, locations of stash houses, names of a few suppliers. It's enough to hurt them, but not enough to shut them down completely." Jack frowned. "They'll regroup, probably bring in reinforcements." Mason nodded grimly. "That's what I'm worried about. These guys aren't just a local gang. They've got connections outside Ridgepoint. Cutting off the head doesn't kill the body, it just makes it angrier." Jack crossed his arms, his mind already churning through plans. "Then we make sure they don't get the chance to strike first." Mason eyed him warily. "What are you thinking?" "Defense," Jack said. "I'm not going to sit here waiting for them to show up on my doorstep again. I need to fortify this place." Mason sighed. "I'll do what I can to keep patrols near your property, but you know we're stretched thin." "I'm not relying on patrols," Jack replied. "I've been through worse with less." Over the next few days, Jack turned the farmhouse into a defensive stronghold. He installed motion sensors around the property, replaced the locks on all the doors, and reinforced the windows with plywood and metal bars. He even dug shallow trenches near the tree line, filling them with broken glass and other deterrents. Ella helped where she could, her hands steady as she hammered nails or painted warning signs to post along the perimeter. Despite the grim circumstances, the work seemed to bring a spark back to her. One evening, as they worked on securing the barn, Ella asked, "Did you have to do stuff like this in the Marines?" Jack nodded. "Sometimes, but it's different when it's your home." Ella looked at him, her expression serious. "Will you teach me?" Jack paused, the hammer in his hand hovering mid-swing. "Teach you what?" "How to fight. How to protect myself." He hesitated. The idea of Ella needing to fight made his chest tighten, but he also knew the value of preparation. "Okay," he said finally, "but it's not just about fighting. It's about thinking ahead, staying calm, and knowing when to act." Ella nodded, her resolve clear. "I'm ready." The first lesson took place in the backyard, under the shade of a sprawling oak tree. Jack started with the basics: how to stand, how to throw a punch, and how to break free from a grab. Ella was a quick learner, her movements growing sharper and more confident with each practice round. "Good," Jack said as she blocked his mock punch. "But don't just react. Anticipate what's coming next." Ella nodded, her brow furrowed in concentration. Meanwhile, the town buzzed with whispers about Vince's arrest. Some residents saw it as a long overdue victory, while others worried about the gang's retaliation. Tom Harris, the mechanic, stopped by one evening to deliver supplies and share the latest rumors. Word is, Vince's brother, Caleb, is coming to town, Tom said. And he's meaner than Vince. Jack frowned. What do you know about him? Runs a bigger operation out west, Tom replied. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking. Vince was small-time compared to him. Jack's gut churned. He had dealt with men like Caleb before, calculating, ruthless, and unrelenting. Late one night, as Jack sat cleaning his rifle, Ella came downstairs, clutching a sketchbook. Can't sleep? Jack asked. Ella nodded, sitting beside him. I was thinking about defenses. You know, traps and stuff. She opened the sketchbook to reveal drawings of makeshift alarms, barricades, and escape routes. Jack smiled faintly. You've got a good head for this. Ella shrugged. I just don't want to feel helpless again. You won't, Jack said firmly. We'll be ready for whatever comes. 2 days later, the first sign of retaliation came. Jack found fresh tire tracks near the edge of the property, along with an empty beer bottle and a cigarette butt. It wasn't much, but it was a message. We're watching. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack and Ella sat on the porch, their eyes scanning the darkening tree line. You think they'll come tonight? Ella asked. Maybe, Jack said. Or maybe they're just trying to rattle us. Ella tightened her grip on the practice stick Jack had carved for her. I'm not scared. Jack looked at her, pride swelling in his chest. You're stronger than you know. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Jack made one final round of the property, ensuring every sensor and alarm was in place. He knew the red vultures weren't done, but he also knew that this time, he wouldn't be caught off guard. For Jack, the fight was no longer just about survival. It was about sending a message of his own. You picked the wrong family. This chapter develops the bond between Jack and Ella as they prepare for the inevitable retaliation. It showcases their growing resilience and resourcefulness, emphasizing the importance of preparation and teamwork. The tension builds steadily, with the looming threat of Caleb Cole adding a new layer of danger. The town of Ridgepoint was alive with whispers. Word of Vince Cole's arrest and the rumored arrival of his brother, Caleb, spread like wildfire. Some locals breathed a sigh of relief, while others braced for what they feared was inevitable. Jack, however, wasn't waiting to see what Caleb's next move would be. He spent every morning reinforcing the farmhouse and every afternoon training Ella. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, but Jack knew they couldn't stand alone against what was coming. It was time to rally the town. Jack's first stop was Tom Harris's auto shop. Tom greeted him with a grim nod, wiping his hands on a grease-stained rag. I figured you'd be stopping by, Tom said. Jack leaned against the counter. The red vultures aren't just going to disappear. We need to be ready. Tom frowned. You're talking about the town? Jack nodded. We need people who are willing to stand up, who aren't afraid to fight back. Not just for themselves, but for everyone. Tom sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. You'll get some, but not everyone. Most folks around here are scared, Jack. The vultures have been running this place for years. Then it's time to change that, Jack said firmly. That evening, Jack hosted a meeting at the farmhouse. He invited Tom, Mia's parents, and a few other trusted townsfolk who he believed shared his determination. The group sat around the kitchen table, their expressions a mix of fear and resolve. Jack began, I know the red vultures have had a hold on this town for a long time, but that doesn't mean we have to keep living in fear. Vince Cole is in custody, but his brother, Caleb, is on his way. If we don't act now, we'll lose whatever chance we have to take back Ridgepoint. Mia's mother, Laura, spoke up. What exactly are you asking us to do, Jack? We're not soldiers. I'm not asking anyone to go to war, Jack replied. But there are things we can do to protect ourselves and our families. We can watch each other's backs, document their movements, and report any activity to the sheriff. And if it comes down to it, we can defend ourselves. Tom nodded. He's right. We've been letting them run things for too long. It's time we showed them they don't own this town. Slowly, the others began to nod in agreement. The next few days were a flurry of activity. Jack and Tom coordinated efforts to fortify key areas in town, including the school and the auto shop. They set up informal patrols to keep watch on the roads and organized a network of communication using burner phones. Ella and Mia played their part by encouraging other students to come forward with stories of bullying and harassment by the Red Vultures. They gathered video evidence of gang members intimidating kids at school, which Jack handed over to Sheriff Mason. At the sheriff's office, Mason leaned back in his chair, studying the evidence Jack had brought. "This is good," Mason admitted. "It gives us more leverage against them, but it's not enough to bring down the whole operation." "What about Caleb?" Jack asked. Mason sighed. "We've got an APB out for him, but the man's a ghost. If he's here, he's keeping a low profile." Jack's jaw tightened. "Then we keep the pressure on his men until he makes a move." One night, Jack's sensors picked up movement near the edge of his property. He grabbed his rifle and flashlight, moving silently through the trees until he spotted the source. A lone biker leaving a message carved into a tree. "You can't stop us." Jack stepped into the light, his gun trained on the man. "Get out of here. Now." The biker froze, his hands raised. "Relax, man. I'm just delivering a message." "You delivered it," Jack said coldly. "Now go, before I change my mind." The biker hesitated before scrambling back onto his motorcycle and speeding off. Jack stared at the message for a long moment before heading back to the house. The tension in Ridgepoint reached a boiling point when a group of bikers vandalized Tom's auto shop, smashing windows and spray-painting threats on the walls. Tom called Jack immediately, his voice shaking with anger. "They're trying to scare us," Tom said. Jack arrived within minutes, helping Tom clean up the mess. As they worked, he said, "This is exactly what they want, to make us feel helpless." Tom nodded. "But we're not going to let them win." Ella's courage continued to grow. One afternoon, she and Mia caught Zane and another gang member harassing a younger student behind the school. Ella pulled out her phone, recording the incident. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. Zane sneered. "Or what?" Ella didn't back down. "Or I'll make sure everyone sees this." Zane glared at her, but eventually backed off, muttering curses under his breath. When Ella showed Jack the video later, he couldn't hide his pride. "You did good, kid, but don't take unnecessary risks." Ella nodded. "I just want to help." One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack and Tom sat on the porch, discussing their next steps. "We're making progress," Tom said. "People are starting to stand up, but it still feels like we're waiting for the other shoe to drop." Jack stared out at the darkening sky. "It is. Caleb's coming. It's just a matter of when." That night, Jack found Ella sketching at the kitchen table. Her latest drawing showed a fortified farmhouse, complete with traps and defensive positions. "This is good," Jack said, sitting beside her. Ella looked up. "You think we'll need all of this?" Jack hesitated. "I hope not, but it doesn't hurt to be prepared." Ella nodded, her expression serious. "I don't want to be scared anymore, Dad." Jack rested a hand on her shoulder. "You're not scared. You're strong. And you're not alone." As the days passed, Jack could feel the tension in the air growing thicker. The townsfolk were rallying, but the threat of Caleb loomed large over Ridgepoint. Jack knew they were running out of time. The Red Vultures weren't going to back down, and neither was he. This chapter focuses on Jack rallying the townsfolk and building a network of support. Ella's courage and resourcefulness continue to grow, paralleling Jack's leadership. The looming threat of Caleb Cole sets the stage for the inevitable confrontation, keeping the tension high. The first sign that Caleb Cole had arrived came on a cold, gray morning. Sheriff Mason called Jack early, his voice tense. "We've got a problem," Mason said. "Meet me at the station." Jack didn't hesitate. By the time he arrived, the sheriff's office was buzzing. Deputies were fielding calls, and Mason stood over a map of Ridgepoint, his brow furrowed. "What's going on?" Jack asked. "Last night, a group of bikers hit the hardware store," Mason said. "Smashed the place up, threatened the owner. We also got reports of them hanging around the school and the diner. They're making their presence known." Jack's jaw tightened. "It's Caleb." Mason nodded. "They're sending a message, all right. And it's not just about Vince anymore. This is about control." The day spiraled from bad to worse. By noon, News spread that Caleb himself had been spotted at the town's old grain silo, a dilapidated structure on the outskirts of Ridgepoint. Jack knew what this meant. Caleb wasn't just visiting. He was setting up a base. Jack gathered the growing group of townsfolk who had been working with him. They met at Tom's auto shop, the atmosphere thick with unease. "They're escalating," Jack began, looking around the room. "We can't let them think they own this town. But we can't be reckless either." "What are you suggesting?" Tom asked. Jack pointed to the map spread across the workbench. "We need to monitor their movements. Find out where they're staying, how many of them there are, and what they're planning." Mia's father, Carl, frowned. "And then what? You think we can take them on?" Jack's voice was steady. "If it comes to that, yes. But the goal is to force them to leave. Make it clear they're not welcome here." The group nodded in agreement, their fear tempered by determination. Meanwhile, Ella and Mia worked on rallying the younger generation. They used social media to share stories of the gang's intimidation, encouraging others to speak out. Videos of the vandalism and harassment spread quickly, shining a spotlight on the Red Vulture's actions. Zane confronted Ella in the hallway after school one day, his face red with anger. "You think you're clever," he snarled. "You're gonna regret this." Ella didn't flinch. "Maybe, but so will you." The exchange left Ella shaken, but she didn't let it stop her. Jack decided to take a more direct approach. That evening, under the cover of darkness, he drove out to the grain silo. He parked a half-mile away and approached on foot, his movements silent and deliberate. The silo was lit by a few dim floodlights, and Jack counted at least 10 bikes parked outside. The faint sound of voices drifted through the night air. Jack crept closer, staying hidden in the shadows. He saw Caleb for the first time, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a calculating expression. Caleb wasn't like Vince. He didn't need to shout to command respect. His presence alone demanded it. Jack listened as Caleb addressed his men. "This town's soft," Caleb said, his voice calm but menacing. "They think they can stand up to us. But we're not leaving until Ridgepoint knows who's in charge." Jack slipped away before he could be spotted, his mind racing. Caleb wasn't just here to avenge Vince. He wanted to turn Ridgepoint into a stronghold. The next morning, Jack met with Sheriff Mason to share what he'd learned. "They've got numbers," Jack said. "At least 10, maybe more. Caleb's setting up shop at the grain silo, and he's planning to dig in." Mason rubbed his temples. "This is bigger than we can handle. I've already reached out to the state police, but it'll take time for them to mobilize." "Then we buy time," Jack said. "Keep them off balance until help arrives." Mason hesitated. "You realize what you're risking?" Jack's eyes hardened. "I'm not risking anything I'm not willing to lose." That night, the Red Vultures struck again. They set fire to the community center, a building Jack and the townsfolk had been using for their meetings. The fire spread quickly, reducing the structure to ash. Jack and Tom arrived just as the flames were dying down, their faces grim. "This was deliberate," Tom said. "They're trying to scare us." Jack nodded. "And it's working. But we can't let it stop us." The fire was the tipping point for many in Ridgepoint. More residents began stepping forward, offering to help. Jack's group grew, their determination fueled by anger and a desire to reclaim their town. Jack spent the next few days coordinating efforts. They set up additional patrols, gathered supplies, and even started building makeshift barricades in key areas. Ella, meanwhile, continued to grow in confidence. She spent hours practicing with the training stick Jack had made her, her movements swift and precise. One evening, she approached Jack as he worked on reinforcing the front porch. "Dad," she said, her voice firm, "if they come, I want to help." Jack paused, looking at her. "You already are." The Red Vultures struck again 2 days later, this time targeting a grocery store. They smashed windows, slashed tires in the parking lot, and left graffiti on the walls. "This town belongs to us." Jack and Mason met at the scene, their frustration mounting. "This is getting out of hand," Mason said. "If we don't stop them soon, they're going to destroy everything." Jack's gaze was cold. "Then we stop them." Late that night, as Jack sat on the porch, Ella joined him. "Do you think we'll win?" she asked, her voice quiet. Jack looked out at the darkened street. "I think we have to. For Ridgepoint. For us. Ella nodded, her resolve unwavering. Then we will. The tension in Ridgepoint was nearing its breaking point, and Jack knew the time for action was fast approaching. Caleb had made his intentions clear, but so had Jack. This was their town, and Jack would do whatever it took to defend it. This chapter escalates the conflict to new heights. The arrival of Caleb Cole raises the stakes, and his calculated actions demonstrate that he's a far more dangerous adversary than Vince. The growing resolve of Jack, Ella, and the townsfolk sets the stage for the impending showdown while continuing to highlight themes of courage, community, and resilience. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and diesel as Jack crouched in the shadows near Ridgepoint's old grain silo. Floodlights bathed the rusting structure in an eerie glow, illuminating the rows of motorcycles lined up outside. Beside Jack, Tom adjusted the strap of his shotgun, his weathered face set with grim determination. Around them, a small group of townsfolk waited silently, their weapons ranging from hunting rifles to makeshift clubs. Jack glanced at the group, then at the silo ahead. It was time. Caleb Cole had pushed Ridgepoint to its breaking point, and tonight, the people of the town were pushing back. Earlier that day, Jack had gathered the group at Tom's auto shop to finalize their plan. They had huddled around a makeshift map of the grain silo, their faces pale but resolute. Jack had kept his voice calm as he explained the strategy. "We hit them hard and fast," he'd said. "Distract them at the perimeter, lock down their exits, and flush them out. The goal is to neutralize Caleb and his men before they have a chance to regroup." Tom had nodded, his gruff voice cutting through the tension. "And if things go south?" Jack's jaw tightened. "They won't. We've prepared for this." Ella had wanted to join the fight, her voice trembling with determination as she begged Jack to let her come. But Jack had refused, assigning her to stay at the farmhouse with Mia's family, monitoring communications. "I need you safe," Jack had told her. "You've already done more than enough." Ella had reluctantly agreed, though the fire in her eyes told Jack she wanted to do more. Now, crouched in the shadows outside the silo, Jack replayed the plan in his mind. Everything depended on precision and timing. The people of Ridgepoint weren't soldiers, but they were angry, united, and ready to defend their home. The first explosion shattered the stillness of the night. A firework rigged to a fuel canister detonated near the silo's far side. The sound was deafening, and flames erupted into the air, casting flickering light over the scene. The red vultures scrambled in confusion, their shouts echoing into the night. "Go!" Jack hissed. His team moved swiftly, advancing through the shadows to the silo's rear entrance. Jack led the way, his movements silent and deliberate. Two guards stood at the door, rifles slung over their shoulders. Before they could react, Jack and Tom took them down, their bodies hitting the ground with muffled thuds. Inside, the silo smelled of motor oil and stale beer. The walls were lined with crates of weapons and supplies, evidence of the gang's growing operation. Jack's team moved room by room, disabling cameras and taking out stragglers. Every step brought them closer to the main hall, where Caleb Cole and his inner circle were likely gathered. When they reached the hall, Jack paused, peering through a crack in the doorway. Caleb stood at the center of the room, his massive frame imposing even at a distance. He barked orders to his men, his voice calm and authoritative. "This town thinks it can stand against us," Caleb said, pacing in front of a table littered with maps and ammunition. "We're not just staying. We're taking it all." Jack stepped into the room, his gun raised. "Not tonight." The room fell silent as Caleb turned, his cold eyes locking onto Jack. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the air between them crackling with tension. Well, Caleb said, a smirk tugging at his lips. "The famous Jack Hunter. I've heard about you. Thought you'd be smarter than this." "I'm smarter than you think," Jack replied. The silence broke as one of Caleb's men lunged toward Jack. A gunshot rang out, and the man crumpled to the ground. Chaos erupted as Jack's team poured into the room, engaging the gang in a brutal fight. Jack moved with precision, his military training taking over. He ducked behind a stack of crates, firing off shots as Caleb's men scrambled for cover. Tom took down two bikers with well-placed blasts from his shotgun, while the others fought with a mix of desperation and resolve. In the midst of the chaos, Caleb charged at Jack, swinging a crowbar with surprising speed. Jack dodged the first blow, but the second grazed his shoulder, sending a jolt of pain down his arm. "You're out of your league," Caleb growled, swinging again. Jack blocked the strike with his forearm, then countered with a punch to Caleb's ribs. The two men grappled, crashing into a stack of crates and spilling ammunition across the floor. Caleb was strong, stronger than Jack had anticipated, but Jack's training gave him the edge. They fought with brutal efficiency, trading blows that left them both bloodied. Caleb grabbed a knife from the floor, slashing at Jack, but Jack deflected the attack, twisting Caleb's arm and sending the blade skittering away. "You think this ends with me?" Caleb snarled, his breath ragged. "There's always someone bigger coming." "Let them come," Jack said, driving his knee into Caleb's chest and slamming him to the ground. Caleb struggled, but Jack pinned him, twisting his arm behind his back. "It's over," Jack said coldly. Outside, the townsfolk had pushed the Red Vultures into retreat. Sheriff Mason and the state police arrived, their sirens cutting through the night as they rounded up the remaining gang members. The tide had turned, and Ridgepoint had taken its stand. As Caleb was dragged away in handcuffs, he spat at Jack, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you've won? This town isn't worth saving." Jack watched him go, his face unreadable. "That's where you're wrong." Back at the farmhouse, Ella ran to meet Jack as he stepped out of the truck. She threw her arms around him, her voice trembling. "I was so scared." Jack held her tightly, his own voice soft but steady. "It's over. They're gone." Ella pulled back, searching his face. "Are you sure?" Jack hesitated. For now, the victory was hard-won, but Jack knew it wasn't the end. There would always be another battle, another threat. But tonight, Ridgepoint was safe, and for the first time in a long while, the people of the town had hope. Jack sat on the porch that night, Ella beside him, watching the horizon as the first hints of dawn broke through the darkness. Whatever came next, he knew they would face it together. This chapter delivers an action-packed climax with high stakes and emotional resonance. Jack's confrontation with Caleb cements his role as the protector of Ridgepoint, while the town's victory over the Red Vultures symbolizes the strength of unity and resilience. The sun rose slowly over Ridgepoint, casting golden light across the town's quiet streets. The echoes of the previous night's battle still lingered, but with each passing moment, they began to fade. For the first time in years, Ridgepoint felt like it could breathe again. At the farmhouse, Jack stood on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand. The soreness in his muscles was a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. But they hadn't lost. Ridgepoint had stood together and pushed back against the darkness. Behind him, Ella appeared in the doorway, her hair still messy from sleep. She wore the practice stick Jack had carved for her slung across her shoulder, a sight that brought a small smile to his face. "Morning, Dad," she said, her voice still groggy. "Morning," Jack replied, gesturing to the horizon. "It's a new day." Ella joined him on the porch, her gaze drifting to the yard where they had spent so many hours training. The world felt different now, quieter and lighter, but she knew better than to believe the fight was truly over. Later that morning, Sheriff Mason arrived at the farmhouse, his patrol car kicking up dust as it rolled to a stop. He stepped out, his hat tilted low over his eyes. "Morning, Jack," Mason said. "Sheriff," Jack replied, shaking his hand. "What brings you by?" Mason glanced at Ella, who had joined them, before lowering his voice. "Just wanted to say thank you. We couldn't have done this without you." Jack nodded. "It wasn't just me. The whole town stepped up." Mason sighed. "They did, but we both know it won't be long before someone else tries to fill the void Caleb left. That's why we stay ready," Jack said simply. Mason hesitated, then added, "I wanted to let you know, the state police are processing the arrests. Most of Caleb's men are staying locked up for a long time. And as for Caleb himself, well, he's not going anywhere anytime soon." Jack's lips pressed into a thin line. "Good." As Mason turned to leave, he paused. "You ever think about sticking around in an official capacity? The town could use someone like you." Jack raised an eyebrow. What are you suggesting? Not as a deputy, Mason said, but maybe as a consultant. Someone to help keep an eye on things. Think about it. Jack nodded, though he didn't respond. Over the next few weeks, Ridgepoint began to heal. The damage the red vultures had inflicted, both physical and emotional, was still evident, but the community rallied to rebuild. Broken windows were replaced, walls were repainted, and businesses reopened their doors. The community center, burned down in the gang's final act of defiance, became a symbol of resilience. Plans to rebuild it were already underway, with volunteers from every corner of Ridgepoint pitching in. Ella and Mia helped organize a fundraiser at the school, raising money for supplies and construction. The event was a resounding success, bringing the community together in a way that hadn't been seen in years. One evening, as Jack and Ella sat on the porch watching the sun set, she spoke up. "Do you think it'll ever really be over?" she asked, her voice quiet. Jack thought for a long moment before answering. "There will always be challenges, but we've proven we can face them, and we don't have to do it alone." Ella nodded, her gaze steady. "Do you think you'll take the sheriff's offer?" Jack tilted his head, studying her. "You think I should?" She smiled faintly. "I think you're good at keeping people safe, and it'd be nice to know we're not going back to how things were before." Jack chuckled softly. "You're wise for your age, you know that?" Ella grinned. "I had a good teacher." The weeks turned into months, and Ridgepoint continued to transform. Ella thrived at school, her confidence growing with each passing day. She joined the track team, made new friends, and even started mentoring younger students who looked up to her for her bravery. Jack, meanwhile, took on the sheriff's offer in an unofficial capacity. He worked closely with Mason to train the deputies, teaching them tactics and strategies he had learned during his military service. His presence became a steadying force in Ridgepoint, a reminder of what the town had overcome. One morning, Jack found Ella sitting at the kitchen table with her sketchbook open. She was designing plans for the new community center, her pencil moving quickly across the page. "What's this?" Jack asked, leaning over her shoulder. Ella looked up, her face alight with excitement. "Just some ideas for the center. I was thinking we could add a space for self-defense classes, so people can feel more prepared." Jack smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "I think that's a great idea." On the anniversary of the Red Vulture's defeat, the town gathered at the site of the new community center for a groundbreaking ceremony. Jack stood beside Ella, watching as the first shovels of dirt were turned. As the crowd cheered, Ella looked up at her father. "We did it." Jack placed a hand on her shoulder. "No, Ridgepoint did it. Together." Ella smiled, and for the first time in a long while, the future felt bright. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack and Ella sat on the porch once more. The farmhouse was quiet, the town peaceful, and the air was filled with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. Ella said, "I used to think Ridgepoint was just a place we ended up because we didn't have anywhere else to go. But now it feels like home." Jack nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It is home, and no matter what comes next, we'll protect it." The two of them sat in silence, watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. For the first time, Jack allowed himself to believe that they were no longer just surviving. They were living, and Ridgepoint, once a town shrouded in fear, had become a place of hope and resilience. This chapter concludes the story on a hopeful note, showing the strength of community and the importance of standing together against adversity. Jack and Ella's growth is evident, and Ridgepoint's transformation serves as a testament to the power of unity and courage. The story ends with a sense of peace, but also a readiness for whatever challenges may come.